understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? It is, again, the height of summer. You may well be on holidays. I hope wherever you are, you are enjoying yourself. You are kicking back in the sun. Or if you are at home, you are dodging the rain and the usual carry on. But sure, what can we do? What can we do? John, how are you, Head?
I'm great. Do you know what, Mac? I've just as you're talking away there, by the way, I'm looking at Macker down the screen here. He's off in Croatia, as always, for the summer. But I'm just
not the
hearing
whole summer now. Not the whole summer, but go on.
Well, but I'm just hearing these amazing birds behind you.
Yeah, well,
Twitter,
I suppose.
And they're unfamiliar. I'm quite familiar with bird song and stuff because I'm a bit of a twitcher.
Yeah.
But that bird behind you, I don't know if you can hear it. Hang on just 1 second. It's amazing.
Well, it's funny, John, you would love it here because basically, just so you know, dear listener, basically John is really
weird.
Into the environment. No, you're not weird. No, weird is JD Vance. And have you noticed that's really
JD.
That's really freaking out the Republicans. The fact that the Democrats have alighted upon this word, you're weird. And it's really sticking that basically all the Republican candidates that go on the telly are being dismissed now as you're a weirdo. You're weird. And that's really it's really freaking them out. They hate it because they can't, there is no comeback. You know, when you start talking about cat ladies and things, it's like, you're weird. You're actually not one of us. You're not a normal person. And it's actually a classic. But let's go back to the bird song, John. So just so you know, John is and has always been, as long as I've known him, a man subsumed by, involved in, affected by the natural world. And it's a beautiful thing to see because I am the opposite. I go around my head in the clouds, don't really know what's going on around me in the natural world. And here in Croatia, I presume, John, now you can get me wrong, it's because Croatia and all of the former Yugoslavia, all the Balkans, is probably on some massive migratory bird path, a flight path.
Yeah, it would be, I suppose. Yeah, it would be.
From down south, from down in the Middle East, down in Africa, the birds coming up north. Because again, if you look right down the Adriatic, you know, there's a reason that the Suez Canal's major port was Trieste, which is on the elbow of the Adriatic. Because you look right down the Adriatic, you're in Africa straight away. And in fact, if you go out in a boat, you could probably sail unimpeded to Africa from here. There's nothing else. And therefore, I'd say this is why...
there was an amazing study done looking at Russian eagles that they tracked from northern Iran. They went up to Kazakhstan and then back down through Saudi Arabia, all the way over to like Sudan, Ethiopia, and East Africa.
Wow.
An incredibly huge migratory route.
From northern Iran, I mean, that's quite a circuitous route. They're almost doing a big arc.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, well, again, thank you, John, for alerting me to the wildlife around me.
Tune in and just be for a while.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because at the Book Festival in Turkey, Monken McGann and Sean Ronayne had a lovely piece on bird song and the natural world and all that good stuff, you know?
Yeah, he's wonderful, actually, your man, Sean.
Did you see his documentary? It was really sweet.
Yeah. Really gorgeous stuff.
But, you know, John, you could do a Twitchers podcast, you know? Yourself and a couple of Twitchers could be out there listening to bird song. You could be discussing, you know, where the birds come from. I can see it. It's a branching out. Branching out. People really like that sort of stuff. Anyway, so here I am in my portable own aviary in Croatia, listening to birdsong. I will ask the locals, John, what that bird is making that noise.
It's completely unfamiliar to me.
And what I will do is next week on the podcast, we will discuss it. You know, It's a little bit tangential from our general economics talk, but I'm with you.
It's important, Macker. It's important.
It is important. It is important, and it's an important. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today, John, is social mobility. And we're going to talk about in the context of...
From birds' mobility to social mobility.
Exactly. Branching out on all branches. Now, what we're going to talk about is this generation being the first generation in Ireland in about 2 generations to potentially be poorer than their parents. And what that is going to do, not just to society, but what it's going to do to their own career choices, what it's going to do to the class system, the class structure, the ranking, the position, all that sort of stuff, right? Because, for years and years and years, I've always been kind of fascinated by class snobbery in Ireland, right? The sort of ridiculous small. And in fact, you could argue that a lot of the books that I've written in the past, things like The Pope's Children, those sort of books were actually all about social class and how it was changing and how the society was changing. So it's always kind of intrigued me as a form of ranking and communication within societies. So how people look at accents, how people look at education levels, how people look at not just the acquisition of goods, which is what, if you're rich, you buy a fancy car. But then what I'm always interested in is that the old middle class then, when they're outcompeted on finance and capitalism and commerce, they throw up all sorts of other affectations that the new rich can't quite get their heads around, like traditional education or what you eat or affectations like where you go on holidays, all that sort of carry on. I've always found these to be really interesting signals. But I want to talk to you about social class here in the context of, I remember in the 1980s, when Ireland's social class was unbelievably rigid, a friend of mine's mother, who I'd never met before, on hearing my name, because you rock up to someone's house and you never met their ma before, hear my name, said, "Oh, Mac Williams, is that the legal family?" Right? I just thought it was... And on my response in the negative, I don't think I was ever invited back to the kitchen again. I always thought that was... those sort of things kind of stay with me because I'm really fascinated by why the social hierarchy is the way it is. And I think, ultimately, let's just say we didn't get invited to that Debs. That was the Debs we didn't get invited to. Right? And then if you look at what happened in Ireland, right, and this is the fascinating thing, is since the Celtic Tiger, we have had quite dramatic, even just before it, we've had quite dramatic social uplift. And by that I mean, and this is what, again, the Pope's Children book was all about, was the social uplift in society where lots and lots of people in general saw their position in society move dramatically into the middle, right?
Yeah.
And that was a very, very positive thing. But if you think about the Ireland prior to that, and the reason I was triggered by this was the death of Edna O'Brien. So Edna O'Brien, I happen to think, is probably the most consequential woman born in the Republic of Ireland. So born in our society, because she really broke the mold. I mean, this is a woman who was from County Clare, who wrote 3 books that were banned. Do you know that there was actually official book banning episodes of her books? That her books were not only banned, but they were burned, like the Nazis. They burned Country Girls, her book, right?
Yes.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
In Ireland, in the early 1960s. Now, think about what that must have done to her own psychology. She died at 93. She wrote dozens of novels. Dozens.
Yeah.
She was a complete national treasure. She was hounded out of the country by the Catholic Church. She was hounded out of the country by McQuaid, and a bizarre alliance of McQuaid and Charlie Haughey, who was a minister at the time, a young minister in the government. And he was finger pointed. A man with no morals, right? Okay, and that's what always happened. But, she was a young mother of 2 who decided to write in her spare time, fascinated by all the greats. She wrote about, in effect, just Country Girls is about 2 girls leaving their small little village and coming up to Dublin. And then one of them shacking up with a guy called Mr. Gentleman, who obviously wasn't a gentleman at all. I mean, there is a direct line through Edna O'Brien, from Edna O'Brien, all the way to Sally Rooney. I mean, you can see the entire thing.
Yes.
She basically blazed the trail for almost all of the writers that we now revere, your Anne Enrights, your Colm Tobins, this idea of writing about the society and being critical in the society. And again, you can imagine if your own country turns against you, which it did, how incredibly isolating and upsetting that must have been.
Well, it was just that section of Irish society that turned against her. The McQuaid-loving and God-fearing and De Valera-loving part of society.
But as I always thought, very few people stood up for her,
Yeah, and we weren't great at that.
That's the thing. We weren't great at that. So we went along, and the idea was that She was writing about an Ireland of no social mobility. So there was no social mobility, there was no commercial mobility, there was no sexual mobility, if you want to describe it as that. There was no idea of experimentation. And she was writing about a real Ireland because, of course, people had sex. I mean, the whole thing about the church is, what do you think people were doing all the time? What do you think? And again, it was like this shamed woman and all that sort of stuff. So I think that someone like Edna O'Brien really is in the pantheon of Irish women who took on the church unwittingly. She actually still went to mass. And when I met her, I'm going to tell you about meeting her, when, she was still very much part of somebody who was infused by the Catholic faith and the ritual and all that.
Really?
But yeah. And not particularly bitter at all. She was, her ability to rise above the fray. Now, of course, this was all a function of the fact that she over time became more and more and more revered. And that gave her inner strength. But I just think that great male way of bullying young women, which we see in all societies, just came out again in Ireland in the 1960s. And she became this kind of symbol of the whore of Babylon and all that sort of stuff. Dreadful stuff. And
she
then
disappeared over to London, though, didn't she?
She lived in London. She lived in London with her husband, a guy called Stan Gebler, and they had 2 kids, one of whom, Carlo Gebler, is a brilliant, brilliant writer. In fact, he wrote an amazing book on the burning of Bridget Cleary, John. It's an amazing story about a witch who was burned in Tipperary at the end of the last century, of the 19th century.
No way, really?
Yeah. Bridget Cleary, Google it, right? And Carlo Gebler's account of this is, for me, still the outstanding book on this particular issue, which was mental health issues in a very, very, very poor society were regarded as being proximate to the devil.
Right.
And this woman, Bridget Cleary, who I would say now would be diagnosed with all sorts of mental health problems, was regarded as the devil. And the people around her, they burned her in her own house. It's an extraordinary story. And this happened all in Ireland.
Never heard of that.
Bridget Cleary, just Google it. Extraordinary stuff. But Carlo Gebler, Edna O'Brien's son, wrote that. But the reason I talked about Edna O'Brien is I got a call in around 2010, not a call, an email from Edna O'Brien. Yeah. And I was fascinated because she's been a complete hero of mine for years. And she said, I want to write a book about the economy, the crash, how it happened, what's going to happen now. I need this background. So I went and I met her in the Marion Hotel, and she was so glamorous. But the fascinating thing for me was that she was doing research in the most precise, detailed, unbelievably organized way. And she wanted to place a character who was affected badly by the economic crash. So she could have written that. But no, she said, no, I want to understand how it happened, how it works, how does the economy work, how does the banking system work? So we sat down and we chatted about it. And I was expecting her to write a book about that. But I think she shelved that project. But she wrote a book subsequently, right, called Little Red Chairs, which involved, and the reason it's fascinating for me now, involved a woman in Ireland who, again, was a little bit lost against the background of the economic crisis and the Celtic Tiger and the boom and all that sort of, just that period. Yeah. And she fell in love with a kind of a tall, dark stranger. The tall, dark stranger ended up being a Yugoslavian war criminal. And the book is based, the guy's name is Vlad, but the book is based, which actually, given Putin's subsequent incarnation, is quite accurate. But it based loosely on the life of a guy called Radovan Karadzic, who was the leader of the Bosnian Serbs, who went into hiding in Belgrade and re-emerged as a faith healer. This is all true, John.
Right. Okay. I remember him. I remember he was the guy with the big quiff in his hair.
The guy with the big quiff. But the book, The Little Red Chairs, is something phenomenal. In 2012, and Sarajevo is a city I try to go to when I'm down here every year because it's simply a magical place. It's, if anybody's ever in this region, get to Sarajevo if you can.
Yeah.
It's infused with history, with politics, with culture. It feels like a little bit of the Ottoman Empire. It feels, of course, because it's full of mosques. It's an extraordinary place, right? And it's fun and it's interesting. It's late night. But The Little Red Chairs is the title of our book. And what The Little Red Chairs were, John, was an exhibition in 2012 which was called the Sarajevo Red Line, which was red chairs for every single individual who was killed in the siege of Sarajevo,
Oh,
which is
wow.
over
Okay.
11,000 people. They were killed
Wow.
mainly by snipers. So think about that, right?
And
There was
what's with the
300
chair's symbol?
It was just that idea that there's somebody, it's the empty chair. The person should be
Right.
sitting there, but they're not there. You know, so the empty
Yeah,
chair
yeah.
idea. And the little red chairs were the 623 children who were murdered by the Bosnian Serbs in the siege of Sarajevo, which went on for 44 months.
Wow.
380,000 people deprived of food, water, electricity,
Yeah,
everything.
yeah.
And of course, this is what's going on in Gaza. Same carry on.
Yeah.
And her book was basically about the love affair between this woman, this Irish woman, and this guy who managed to evade justice and end up in Ireland. And it's a big biopic and the whole thing. But what was fascinating about Edna O'Brien, for me, was the way in which she could take those sort of, you know, a love story, a normal love story. Things happen, people fall in love, they meet somebody, you know, this person is unusual. It's the story was about immigration. It was about Irish society. It was about the change of the world. And of course, the whole thing ends up tragically when he's exposed as having been one of the significant players in the Sarajevo siege on the Bosnian Serb side. So one of the perpetrators. And that's what happened. And the reason that the faith healing thing is interesting is Karadzic actually went to ground in Serbia and re-emerged as a sort of a Reiki fucking healer. And he had actually, I swear to God. So next time you see a Reiki faith healer, John, a Reiki healer, you've got to worry about it. But what interesting...
So his acupuncture was a little bit more severe, was it? It's a dagger.
Exactly. But I mean, again, if you want to understand European history and European culture, there is no better place to go than Sarajevo. It's both Europe's past and Europe's future.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay, yes. Mark, just to bring it back to social mobility and get you out of that tangent.
All right. Okay. So we're going to talk about social mobility in a second. All I'm just saying is Edna O'Brien was interested. She was writing about an Ireland that had no social mobility.
Right.
What we're going to talk about is an Ireland that has social mobility, had social mobility, maybe that has stopped. And are there any lessons we can derive from other countries to tell us how the society is likely to actually reset and recalibrate after social mobility has stopped? So we talk about that after the break?
Indeed.
And just listen to the birds, John. Listen to the birds.
Okay, Mac, we started there talking about social mobility and then we went off on a tangent, but hey ho, that's the way it goes.
And Sarajevo and Edna O'Brien. No, but just she's a big character in Ireland, I think.
Absolutely.
But okay,
let's bring it back to social mobility in Ireland from pre-80s and the change in the 80s onwards.
Yeah, so basically what I'm fascinated, John, by now is Ireland had no social mobility from about 1920 to 1980, right? So basically the upper middle class, the middle class was largely the old Protestant commercial class and professional class, and there was an emerging big Catholic class that were largely, I think it's fair to say, the sons and daughters of revolutionaries. So you get this extraordinary situation where people whose parents actually fought in the Rising, okay, and were actually part of that movement, basically ended up divvying up the spoils between themselves over the course of the next 20 or 30 years. So you see a kind of direct line. And that's what happened. Whereas the average person who didn't do any of the fighting was like, oh, okay, fine, fair enough. Here we go again. So then what you get in the 1990s is the beginning of the Celtic Tiger period, where all the data shows that more and more people moved up a social class or two, simply because there were probably more professional and managerial jobs around. Yep. So, you know, manufacturing is dying, certain parts of manufacturing are dying, agriculture is getting smaller, but a lot of professional managerial positions are being taken up, the economy is opening up, the multinationals are coming in, business is expanding, all that sort of stuff, right? Now, that has lasted for about 3 decades. And the question now, is that coming to an end, right? That's the first thing. And the second thing, if it is coming to an end, are there any examples of how societies recalibrate after an upswing in social mobility and what happens? So the best way to look at this is to look at the United States. So the United States had this idea of the American dream, John. So the American dream was very much that idea in the 1950s that everyone was getting richer,
Yeah.
and into the 1960s and into the 1970s. And that fueled an expansion of the United States creatively, culturally, economically, socially, all that stuff, right? That was the Vietnam War, but the backlash against the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, the hippie movement, rock and roll, drugs, all that good stuff, right? This is all part of a huge baby boom, the boomers, who were born into societies where the social mobility was increasing, where their parents were getting richer. I'll give you one statistic, John, which is fascinating, right? In the United States, 90% of people born in the United States in 1940 earned more than their parents did by the age of 30. So 90% of Americans born in 1940 who reached the age of 30 in the early 70s were earning more than their parents were earning at the same age.
Right.
So that shows enormous social uplift.
So the golden age after the Second World War, the 1950s, and
Exactly. All that sort of stuff. Now, you compare that to those born in 1980. I used to call these people the Pope's children in Ireland, born around that period, right?
Yeah.
Only 50% of people born in 1980 were richer than their parents were by the age of 30. So compare that to 90%. So what you're seeing is a dramatic change in the way in which families have been treated by the economic cycle. Now, the question is, in that golden age, the American dream, did we have an Irish dream, an Irish golden age of social mobility in that period, 1990 to, let's say, 2000 and maybe 2015, 2020?
Right.
And if that's the case, what lessons can we learn from America? And one of the fascinating things you learn from America is that what you choose to do is unbelievably important when the economy stops rising all boats on this rising tide. So when the economy stops growing dramatically, and when arguably the low-hanging fruit of social mobility is picked, it begins to change. And what you see, something amazing in the States, is there was a really interesting NPR documentary with Planet Money. And Planet Money is a very, very good podcast on all things monetary. And I'd like now to give a hat tip to a guy called David Higgins, who's a young Irish economist who alerted me to this on Twitter. And he's got a Substack well worth having a look at. Now, what the data shows is that the kids who do much better than their parents tend to be dentists, doctors, and surgeons, right? And the reason is they don't necessarily come from the richest class in America. So dentists, doctors, and surgeons in the United States come from more or less the middle of the middle. And they have done extremely well over the last 30 years.
Why is that? Or is there a specific reason for that?
Because I think it's basically it's like Ireland. You know, the kids of school teachers always seem to do quite well because they're being pushed along, right? I think what basically happens is
says Macker, the son of a school teacher.
Of a school teacher. No, but there is though. So I think what it is that there is a commitment amongst people in the middle to try and improve their stock, and they do it through education, right?
Yeah.
This has significant implications for immigration in Ireland in the future, John, because a lot of first-generation immigrants push their children quite dramatically into those sort of technical professions like doctors, surgeons, that idea where they know they're going to do well.
Yeah.
So what you see is that's the first thing. The second thing is that rather snobby mother about the legal family actually had a point, because what you see in America is lawyers and judges who do much better than their parents tend also to come from lawyers and judges. Their parents were in the top 10 percentile of the distribution, right? So basically, rich lawyers produce rich lawyers, as a general rule, right? But what is fascinating also is that the kids that do worst or have done worse in America relative to their parents are artists, musicians, and designers. And this is something fascinating. If you go back, there's lots of research to say that middle-class kids, or let's say the other way around, the arts and the creative industries tend to have more middle class children in them, going into them, than other industries. And the reason is that because their parents are reasonably well off, they can probably choose to do things they want to do rather than have to do jobs they have to do. And this leads to another fascinating idea, which the Americans call lost Einsteins. If you look in the United States, because wealthier kids go into doing creative jobs that they can express themselves more in and invest more in, what you get something amazing is that the top 1%, so children from the top 1% of Americans, so really rich kids, are 10 times more likely to be innovators. Isn't that amazing?
Right. Okay.
10 times more likely. And the reason this is the case is because they are A, in areas that they really want to do, and B, they have a bigger personal stake in this. There's also something which I would call...
How do you mean a bigger personal stake?
Because they're basically like they're artists, they're creatives, etc. So you've got this bizarre thing, right? Is that it's two things going on at one time. Musicians, artists, actors, designers, set designers, theatrical people, filmmakers, all of these professions in the United States have ended up 40% less wealthy than their parents. And this is a huge, huge, huge drop in income. But within that statistic, there is also the top of those people become highly creative. So it's a very strange dilemma. So it's it's that idea. There's only one Oscar winner. It's that idea of Cillian Murphy, reasonably middle class background. He becomes the standout actor. But in general, actors see a dramatic fall off in their income vis-a-vis their families. Same for musicians, same for designers, same for all sorts of things, right?
I would say that there was a lot of, why don't you get a proper job kind of thing coming from their parents.
Completely.
I heard that so many times. I
know, with your sound engineering, what class of job is that? As I always said, my father used to refer to economics as a cod. Like, they say, what are you doing? What's that stuff? But I think one of the reasons that those kids do quite well, those top creative kids do quite well, is what I would call kitchen table capital, right? Kitchen table capital is a description of the environment in which you're brought up in. So they have better access to networks. They have better access to advice. They've somebody they've seen do something successful before them. They have more possibilities because the kitchen table around which they are raised gives them more what they call social capital.
Yeah.
The downside is this lost Einstein's idea, which is that if only rich people are rich kids, or if a preponderance of rich kids are innovators, can you imagine what would happen if all those poorer kids were given the opportunity to be innovators? You'd have thousands of Einsteins, right? That's the lost Einstein idea. But this is all interesting for us because this is the fallout of the end of social mobility in America, where the choices that kids are making are really consequential for their long-term wealth, their long-term security, their long-term position in society. So basically the idea is, John, once the conveyor belt, if you imagine social mobility to be a conveyor belt, once that conveyor belt stops, then what you see is the society recalibrates. And the American boomers, and I think one of the reasons you see so much culture wars in the United States, there's so much anger in the United States, there's so much interpolitical hatred, there's so many tribes, there's so many dogmatic positions, and everyone's entrenched, I think is because of this. And this is the really consequential thing for us in Ireland.
So what you're saying then is that upward social mobility is inevitable in a kind of a capitalist free market economy. But what's also inevitable is that stalls after a while. It kind of reaches capacity and mushrooms out, as it were.
You're absolutely right. So basically what you see is in all developing economies after the Second World War, you see it in Asia now. Ireland is a late developer because we went down the crazy route, the sort of route that bullied Edna O'Brien.
Yeah.
And so our development is much later, but Italian society, French society, British society had this massive social uplift in the 70s and 80s, right? We waited until the 90s. But after that, when that stops, and for example, the Asians are going through this now. So Chinese people, Korean people, etc., are going through this massive social uplift right now. But once that stops, then sort of slightly traditional occupations and professions tend to re-establish themselves. And in the arts, what you find is a dramatic fall off for lots and lots of kids. What you find a dramatic increase are what I would call the more technical professions like medicine and all these sort of ones, right?
Yeah.
Now it's well worth. We'll actually post the data on Twitter because it's well worth when we publish this podcast.
Yeah, but then there's also, as I was saying about this mushrooming out. So while an economy is developing and there is social mobility, people are moving up the ladder, as it were, there needs to be somebody coming in at the end to kind of support that, to underpin that economy, which are the immigrants. So this obviously has a huge impact on immigration and attitudes to immigration.
Completely. So when you have, for example, an increase in prosperity, and when you have a generalized feel-good factor that everyone's doing okay, then what you find is attitudes to immigration are much, much looser, much, much tolerant, much, much more, come on in and we can all share in this beneficial upswing. Once that stops, then I think you're into the problem. So if you look, for example, American attitudes to immigration, interestingly, in the 1950s and 1960s and into the 70s, it was very, very difficult to get into the United States. It was actually quite difficult to get into the United States. They had quite closed borders actually during those periods, right? And that's a hangover from the 1920s when they sealed themselves off completely. But what you see is two things. One is that first generation immigrant children tend to be pushed into typical middle-class professions by their parents. So there's a sort of a situation where, this is why, for example, there are so many Asian doctors in the UK. Just take, for example, that's one example, Indian doctors, etc., right? And in Ireland. And that's the first thing. But the second thing is then, if the feel-good factor in a society begins to dissipate, then people look for scapegoats. They look for someone to blame, right?
Yeah.
And again, what I'm saying in the United States is that sort of crazy anger that you feel in the United States can, in my estimation, be related back to the fact that social mobility has stopped and that people aren't earning as much as their parents.
Yeah.
And therefore there's intergenerational wars, there's intergeographical wars, there's culture wars, there's all these sort of things. And, when you look at Ireland now, what tends to typically happen as well is that it's only when the society's social mobility has peaked, right, that immigration happens with a lagged effect. So immigrants don't come to countries that are on the up. They come to countries that have been on the up and are beginning to peak, right? And the reason is very, very simple, is because you haven't heard about it. By the time The Economist magazine, for example, is writing about a wonderful economy, you can be more or less assured that the thing is over. Yeah. Because it's a lagging indicator. The media is a lagging indicator for what's actually happening. So what I think is going to happen in Ireland, and this is very lamentable in my mind and kind of shocking, and it's not something to be entertained, but I think it is going to happen, is the same sort of trends that we saw in the United States, which is aggression, anger, splitting the society, different people taking hardline positions on immigration, is going to become the same, because simply, as long as people are doing well, they don't really mind who's living next door. But when you're doing badly, then you look for someone to blame, and it's much easier to blame the person with a different skin color or different accent or different language. They're not part of the tribe. We split back into us versus them. And you get the sort of politics that we see in the United States, which is everything's on a knife edge. Everything is binary. Everything is unbelievably consequential. The middle ground is hollowed out. The center, as Yates would say, doesn't really hold. And we get the extremes. And I think if you look at the data from the States, if you look at the professional data, if you look at the income data, and you take the view that Ireland is a couple of decades behind the United States in these developments, I think you can look to the States and say, there's a path we could likely go on, and it doesn't look that pleasant.